I'll never forget that night. Picture this, a quiet cabin tucked against the glassy surface of Clearwater Lake. The air smelled like pine and wood smoke, the kind of crisp scent that only comes when you're a dozen miles from the nearest highway. I had a cold beer sweating in my hand, and across the old oak table from me sat the last person on earth that anyone in my community would have expected, the state attorney general. Yeah, the top legal officer in the entire state. We weren't having some stiff, buttoned-up meeting, either. It was relaxed. Two people talking. He'd stopped by under the radar, looking for first-hand accounts of HOA corruption, and somehow my little fishing cabin had turned into ground zero for a conversation that might change lives far beyond our lake. And then, crash. The front door exploded inward like a scene from a bad cop show. Wood splintered across the floor, hinges squealed in protest, and in stormed a woman in a $1,000 power blazer and heels that clicked across my grandfather's hardwood like gunshots. Delilah Cromwell. Or as the whole community knew her, Karen. The self-proclaimed queen of the HOA. Her perfume hit the room before her words did, sharp, chemical, and so overpowering it felt like an attack all on its own. And then came the yelling. You're in violation of 7 different ordinances. Do you hear me, Marcus? 7. Her voice was shrill, echoing off the log walls of the cabin. She had no idea who she was actually screaming at. No clue that standing 10 feet away from her, quietly setting down his glass of bourbon, was the one man in the state with the authority to dismantle her entire operation. I swear, if I hadn't been so stunned, I might have laughed. Because in that exact moment, Delilah didn't just make a scene, she committed half a dozen felonies in front of the state attorney general himself. Breaking and entering, destruction of property, trespassing, harassment. She was practically live-streaming her own arrest warrant to the 3,000 followers watching her HOA Facebook page. And the irony? She thought I was the problem. She thought she was delivering justice. In reality, she had just kicked down the door of her own downfall. Now, you're probably wondering, how the hell did things get to this point? But looking back now, I realize that night, the one where she burst into my cabin in front of the Attorney General, wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the endgame. So let me take you back. Let me show you how it started. How a peaceful retirement in my grandfather's lakeside cabin turned into a war against one of the most dangerous people I've ever met. And why, if you live in a neighborhood with an HOA, you might want to pay very close attention. Because trust me, people like Karen? They're not just nosy neighbors. They're predators. My name's Marcus Henley. I'm 52 years old, and if you'd asked me a year ago what I wanted out of life, I would have told you something simple: peace and quiet. See, I spent 3 decades crawling through trenches and climbing utility poles, helping lay down power grids across 3 counties. It was honest work, backbreaking sometimes, but it put food on the table and kept the lights on for thousands of families. That slice of heaven? My grandfather's old fishing cabin. Now, let me tell you about this place, because it wasn't just a cabin, it was a living piece of family history. My grandfather, Pop as everyone called him, bought 2 acres on Clearwater Lake back in 1963. Cost him $800. $800 for lakefront land that today would be worth more than most people's entire house. He didn't buy it as an investment. He bought it because he believed in legacy. The cabin itself was made of hand-hewn logs, thick beams that smelled faintly of pine resin even 50 years later. The stone fireplace in the living room wasn't just decorative. Pop built it himself with rocks he hauled out of the lakebed, his calloused hands shaping every piece until it fit just right. The porch creaked in familiar places when you walked across it, like the house itself was greeting you. Every corner had a memory attached. And here's the thing, it wasn't connected to the grid, not because it couldn't be, but because I chose to keep it off-grid. Solar panels on the roof hummed quietly, powering the cabin better than half the houses in town. The water came from a well that produced liquid so clean and cold it could have been bottled and sold. Even the septic system, which most people dread, worked like a dream, because Pop had built it right the first time. Most mornings, I'd wake up early, sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, and watch mist roll across the lake. Loons would bob on the water, their cries echoing through the stillness. Pop used to say, "The land picks you, Marcus, not the other way around." And every time I looked out over that lake, I knew he was right. But Pop also had another saying. One that turned out to be a warning I didn't understand at the time: if someone wants your land real bad, find out why. Because it's usually worth more than they're telling you. At first, I didn't think much of it. But then, she showed up. Delilah Cromwell. Though pretty quickly, everyone just called her that HOA psycho. She blew into our lakeside community like a storm in high heels. 58 years old, always dressed like she was headed to a country club gala instead of a lakefront property meeting. She drove a pearl-white Escalade with vanity plates that literally read Rule 1. I'm not kidding. And the kicker? She wore her HOA President badge pinned on her blazer like it was a sheriff's star. Her mission? To turn our quiet, rustic lake into what she proudly called an upscale resort community. Most of us laughed it off at first. The cabins around Clearwater Lake weren't mansions, they were old fishing shacks and family retreats, patched up over the years with love and sweat, not money. But Karen wasn't joking. Within her first 2 months, 3 elderly couples had already sold their cabins and vanished, replaced by mysterious cash buyers. Coincidence? At the time, maybe. But looking back? That was just her opening move. Her first strike against me came on a Tuesday morning. I remember it crystal clear. I was sipping my coffee on the porch, watching a pair of loons teach their babies to dive, when I heard the sharp, unnatural sound of high heels clicking on my dock. That alone was enough to raise alarm. Heels don't belong on a dock at 7 a.m. Sure enough, there she was. Designer sunglasses perched on her nose, clipboard in hand. She didn't say a word. She just taped a piece of paper to my screen door like some kind of sheriff posting an eviction notice. When I pulled it off, my jaw dropped. Violation citation. Unsightly dock structure damaging community property values. Fine, $500. Compliance required within 72 hours or daily penalties will accrue. I had to read it twice. She was fining me, for my dock. The same dock Pop and I had reinforced together when I was 12 years old. The same dock that had stood through storms, floods, and half a century of lake life without a single problem. Being a reasonable man, I figured I'd try to talk it out. I walked down the steps, waved her over, and said calmly, "Ma'am, my property predates the HOA by about 40 years. Whatever rules you're citing don't apply to me." She gave me this look, the kind that makes you feel like you're already guilty, and said with a smirk, "Everyone on this lake answers to me, sweetie. Ask the Hendersons how well fighting me worked out for them." The Hendersons. Elderly neighbors of mine. Lived here 23 years before suddenly deciding to sell and move out last month. At the time, I thought it was odd. Now, her words made my stomach turn cold. And before I could say another word, she pulled out her phone and started circling my cabin, snapping photos like some sort of appraiser. Solar panels? Click. My vegetable garden? Click. The carved wooden railing my grandfather had made by hand? Click. The smell of her Escalade's chemical air freshener drifted across the yard, making me gag. By the end of that week, I had 3 more citations taped to my door. Each one with escalating fines. Each one a declaration of war. At the time, I thought she was just a power-tripping neighbor. A nuisance. Annoying, but manageable. What I didn't realize was that I'd just become the target in a much bigger, much darker game. And Pop's old warning echoed in the back of my mind louder than ever, "Find out why they want your land, Marcus. Because it's usually worth more than they're telling you." The first citations were irritating. A slap on the wrist I didn't deserve. But by the second month, it was obvious that Karen wasn't just nitpicking. She was waging a full-scale campaign of harassment. It started small, almost laughable. Improper placement of firewood stack, risk to community aesthetics. Fine, $250. Unauthorized solar panel modifications. Fine, $400. Vegetable garden exceeds permitted dimensions. Fine, $350. She was fining me for growing tomatoes, for heaven's sake. At first, I thought maybe she was just picking on me because I refused to bow to her authority. But then I started talking to my neighbors, the ones still holding out. Turns out, they were getting hammered too. Jim and Lila, who lived 2 cabins down, suddenly owed $12,000 in back fines for not repainting their shutters the approved shade of woodland taupe. Martha, a retired schoolteacher, had her bird feeders confiscated because they supposedly attracted invasive species. Even old Mr. Keating, who could barely walk without a cane, got slapped with a citation for unauthorized dock repairs. It wasn't just rules. It was extortion. And Karen didn't just use paperwork. She used humiliation. Every Friday, she'd upload photos of violations to the HOA's Facebook page, captioned with snide remarks. She treated it like a reality show. Who's lowering our property values this week? Neighbors who had once waved kindly at each other were suddenly looking at one another like suspects. Fear had seeped into the bones of our community. And if the online shaming wasn't enough, she had muscle. See, Karen had recruited a couple of lackeys, guys who clearly had nothing better to do than play enforcer. One of them was her nephew, a hot-headed 20-something with too much gym muscle and not enough common sense. The other was a local contractor she kept on her payroll, a man who'd show up in a neon vest and inspect people's homes uninvited. They'd drive around the lake in a golf cart plastered with the HOA logo, writing tickets like they were police officers. The message was clear: resist, and you'd be crushed. I tried ignoring it at first. I crumpled the citations, tossed them in the wood stove, and went about my business. But Karen escalated again. That summer, I hosted a family reunion at the cabin. My kids, my grandkids, everyone gathered to fish, swim, and grill on the porch. It should have been a weekend of laughter and storytelling. Instead, it turned into a nightmare. Saturday afternoon, while the grandkids were splashing in the lake, Karen showed up. No knock. No warning. Just barged onto my property with her clipboard, barking orders like she owned the place. These inflatables are an eyesore. This barbecue violates fire safety ordinances. And this, she pointed at my grandson's chalk drawing on the walkway, is graffiti. I lost it. I told her to get off my property, that I'd had enough of her harassment. My voice must have carried, because neighbors started peeking out of their cabins. For a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, people would stand with me. But then Karen smiled. Not a friendly smile. A predator's smile. You can scream all you want, Marcus. But I own this community. And when I'm done with you, you'll be begging me to take this dump off your hands. And with that, she strutted back to her Escalade and sped off, leaving a cloud of dust and a family reunion soured by her poison. That night, I sat by the fire long after everyone went to bed. Anger burned in my chest, but beneath it was something worse, dread. Because I was starting to see the bigger picture. This wasn't just about power. This was about money. Cabins were being sold off at an alarming rate, and every time a family disappeared, a developer stepped in with cash. Waterfront property was changing hands in weeks, not months. And always, it was Karen orchestrating the pressure. I began keeping records. I saved every citation, every letter, every screenshot of her Facebook posts. I logged the dates of her visits and the families who, suddenly, left. And the deeper I dug, the uglier it got. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was manufacturing violations to push people out. Families who couldn't pay the fines had liens slapped on their cabins. Once the liens piled up, they were forced to sell. And who just happened to have a buyer waiting in the wings every single time? Karen's silent partners. Developers hungry to turn our rustic lake into a gated luxury playground. By midsummer, she had doubled down on me personally. Citations showed up weekly, sometimes daily. She even staged a noise complaint against me when I was sitting alone, quietly reading on my porch. And then came the straw that broke the camel's back. It was a Thursday evening. I was fixing a lure at my workbench when the power flickered, then died. My solar system had never failed me. I went outside, checked the panels, the batteries, all fine. That's when I noticed the wires had been tampered with. Cut clean. Deliberately sabotaged. For the first time, Karen's harassment had turned into outright crime. That night, sitting in the dark cabin with only the fireplace to light the room, I made myself a promise. If she wanted a war, she was going to get one. Not with fists, not with Facebook arguments, but with the truth. Because if I could prove what she was doing, if I could connect the dots, maybe, just maybe, I could take down the self-appointed queen of Clearwater Lake. And as I'd soon discover, the truth had much sharper teeth than Karen ever imagined. Once you hit that point where the lights in your own home go dark because someone deliberately cut your wires, something inside you changes. Fear turns into resolve. Her enforcers started tailing me in their golf cart, showing up wherever I went. Anonymous notes were slipped under my door: stop digging or else. One night, I came home to find the word traitor spray painted across my garage in red. Rachel urged me to lay low. She's feeling cornered, she warned. That makes her unpredictable. But it was too late to stop. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for Jim and Lila, for Martha, for every family who had been pushed out. And with the Attorney General himself now a shadow in the distance, waiting for us to connect the final dots, I knew one thing for certain: Karen's empire was about to crumble. The deeper Rachel and I dug, the more dangerous things became. By late October, it felt like I was living in a thriller novel. Every creak of the porch made me jump. Every unfamiliar car idling at the edge of the road set my pulse racing. Karen's shadow stretched over everything. But we weren't alone anymore. With Rachel's contacts feeding us intel and the Attorney General's office quietly watching, we had leverage. Now, all we needed was the final piece, undeniable proof that Karen was orchestrating the racket. That's when Rachel came up with the idea that would change everything. We set a trap, she said one night, her laptop glowing between us on my cabin table. We give her the chance to do what she always does. But this time, we document every second. No loopholes. No excuses. The plan was deceptively simple. I would accidentally leave my property vulnerable, a small but obvious violation. Something Karen wouldn't be able to resist pouncing on. But instead of standing my ground like before, I'd let her escalate. Push her far enough to reveal her methods, her intimidation, and, hopefully, her financial connection to the developers. Rachel coordinated with a contact inside the AG's office. They arranged for surveillance equipment, cameras hidden in birdhouses, recorders disguised as weather stations. Even my smoke detector was swapped out for a live feed transmitter. It felt surreal, turning my lakeside retreat into a sting operation. But when I looked at the photos of neighbors who had lost everything, Martha's cracked voice, Jim and Lila's foreclosure notice, I knew it was worth it. The bait? A simple dock extension. Nothing fancy. Just a couple of new planks and an out-of-place cooler. Enough to make it look like I'd started construction without proper approval. We didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, I was splitting wood when the familiar roar of Karen's Lexus echoed up the gravel road. She stormed out in heels, clipboard in hand, flanked by 2 HOA board members who looked more like bodyguards than neighbors. Her eyes locked on the dock like a hawk spotting prey. Unapproved structural addition, she barked, scribbling furiously. Multiple fines will be issued. Immediate removal required. I wiped sweat from my forehead and played dumb. Really? It's just a couple of boards. Thought I was allowed to fix my own dock. Fixing is one thing, she snapped. Expansion is another. That's a violation of Article 7, subsection D. The board members flanked her, arms crossed. It was theater, intimidation designed to make me cave. But what she didn't know was that every word, every glare, was being captured in high-definition video. When I didn't back down, her tone shifted from official to menacing. Marcus, you're already on thin ice. You think I don't know about your little meetings with neighbors? The whispers? She leaned closer, her perfume choking the air. Keep pushing me, and I'll bury you. Financially. Legally. Whatever it takes. I forced myself to swallow the anger bubbling in my chest. Is that a threat? Her smile widened, cold and confident. Call it a guarantee. The cameras caught it all. But Rachel and I knew we couldn't stop at intimidation. We needed the money trail. Proof that Karen was personally profiting from the racket. And for that, we'd need her to brag. The next step was riskier. Rachel suggested something bold, baiting Karen with a developer. Through her journalist network, she found an ally, a former real estate consultant who owed her a favor. He'd pose as a developer interested in buying lakefront property. All he had to do was meet Karen, flash some cash, and see if she'd take the bait. The setup was nerve-wracking. They met at a wine bar 2 towns over. Rachel and I sat parked across the street in a borrowed van, headphones on, listening through a wire tucked into our decoy developer's lapel. Karen arrived late, of course, making an entrance in a crimson suit that screamed money. Within minutes, the act dropped. She wasn't the polished, community president anymore. She was a broker, cutting deals in hushed tones, rattling off addresses of families she planned to nudge out. They're weak, she purred, sipping her wine. They'll fold within 6 months. I can have the property in your hands by next summer, cheap. All I ask is my cut up front. My hands clenched into fists as I listened. There it was. Proof. She wasn't just abusing her power, she was cashing in on people's lives. Rachel's eyes met mine in the dim light of the van, wide with the weight of what we were hearing. We had her. Still, the AG's office wanted more, enough to crush her in court, not just embarrass her. So we pushed further, letting Karen dig her own grave. Over the next 2 weeks, Rachel's developer friend met with her twice more. Each time, she got bolder. She bragged about past deals, named other HOA presidents who were in on it, and even mentioned donations she funneled into local campaigns to keep officials friendly. It was bigger than Clearwater Lake. We were staring at a statewide network of HOAs turned into cash cows for corrupt leaders. And Karen was right at the center. But the more evidence we gathered, the more reckless she became. The spray-painted threats escalated into slashed tires. My mailbox was smashed. One night, I came home to find my cabin door unlocked, drawers rifled through. Nothing stolen, just a message, we can reach you anytime. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark with a baseball bat, waiting for the sound of footsteps on my porch. But what kept me steady was knowing the end was near. Rachel assured me the Attorney General himself was preparing to step in. One more push, she said. Just one more, and we'll have enough to bury her. That push came sooner than we expected. Because Karen, drunk on her own arrogance, decided to make an example out of me. At the next HOA special meeting, she called my name first. In front of 50 neighbors, she waved a stack of fabricated fines. Marcus here owes $47,600 in violations. Effective immediately, the HOA is placing a lien on his property. Failure to comply will result in foreclosure proceedings. Gasps rippled through the crowd. People stared at me, pity in their eyes. But Karen had no idea that Rachel was in the back row, recording the whole circus. No idea that every inflated number, every false claim, was another exhibit in the AG's growing case. And no idea that her victory was the moment she crossed the final line. Because the very next week, the Attorney General himself was scheduled to visit my cabin. Quietly. Off the books. He wanted to see the evidence firsthand. And if Karen so much as stepped foot near us during that meeting, well, she'd be walking straight into her own undoing. The night the Attorney General arrived at my cabin, the air felt electric. Not in a poetic way, in the way that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, like a storm's rolling in. I'd cleaned the place twice over, partly out of nerves, partly out of respect. My grandfather's cabin had never hosted anyone more official than a local sheriff or a fishing buddy. Now, the top legal officer in the state was about to sit at my worn oak table, surrounded by the creak of old logs and the hum of cicadas. When his black SUV finally crunched up the gravel drive, Rachel and I exchanged a look. She gave me a sharp nod, game face on. The Attorney General stepped out, no entourage, no press. Just him. Tall, broad-shouldered, carrying himself with the kind of calm authority that made people listen without him saying a word. He shook my hand firmly. Marcus. Rachel. I appreciate you meeting off the record like this. What you've gathered, he trailed off, scanning the stacks of files and flash drives on the table. This could expose one of the largest corruption rings in the state. Hearing him say it out loud gave me chills. We sat down. For 2 hours, Rachel walked him through everything, the doctored fines, the forged signatures, the recordings of Karen's threats, and the sting operation with the fake developer. The Attorney General didn't interrupt often. Just listened, occasionally jotting a note, his expression unreadable. When Rachel finished, the silence stretched. Finally, he leaned back and said, "This is enough to indict her. But I want more. If she resists, if she fights, I need it airtight. That's why I came here myself. To see the scale with my own eyes." I nodded, though my stomach twisted. Because if he was here, it meant the endgame was close. And Karen, someone as paranoid and controlling as her, wasn't going to let go without a fight. As if on cue, headlights swept across the cabin walls. Rachel froze. The AG's eyes flicked to the door. My pulse hammered in my ears. Then, crash. The door blew open, slamming against the wall with a crack that echoed through the cabin. Wood splintered, glass rattled. And there she was. Delilah Cromwell. HOA Karen in the flesh. Hair perfect. Suit pressed. Eyes blazing with self-righteous fury. And behind her, 2 board members lumbered in like enforcers. "Marcus," she screeched, her heels pounding across the wood. "You've crossed the line for the last time. Hosting illegal meetings, conspiring against your HOA, violating ordinance after ordinance." Her words tumbled over each other, shrill and venomous. She hadn't even noticed the Attorney General yet. Then he stood. Calmly. Slowly. Like a judge rising from the bench. Karen froze mid-rant. Her eyes flicked to him, confusion flashing into recognition. The color drained from her face. "Attorney General?" she whispered, suddenly small in the shadow of her own arrogance. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Mrs. Cromwell. I've been hearing quite a lot about you." Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. For once, Karen was speechless. Rachel broke the silence, her voice steady, sharp. "We have you on record, the fake fines, the threats, the backroom deals. It's over." Karen snapped back to life, her defenses kicking in. "Lies. Fabrications. You can't trust these people. They're criminals themselves." She jabbed a manicured finger at me. "He's been violating HOA ordinances for months." The AG raised a hand, silencing her like a gavel hitting wood. "I've heard enough. Your actions tonight alone, breaking and entering, harassment, intimidation, are felonies. And that's before we even get to the financial crimes." One of her board members muttered, "Delilah, maybe we should, quiet," she snapped, turning on him with the same venom she'd used on all of us. But this time, it didn't land. He stepped back, shame flickering in his eyes. The empire was crumbling. Karen spun back toward me, desperation replacing fury. "Marcus, listen to me. Drop this. Take the fines, pay them, and I'll make it all disappear. You can keep your cabin, no foreclosure, no liens. Just walk away." For a moment, the room went still. Then I laughed. Not out of humor, but relief. Because for months, she'd held all the power. And now, in front of the Attorney General, she was begging. "No, Karen," I said. "This time, you don't get to walk away. The AG pulled a small device from his pocket, a badge-shaped recorder that had been running since he stepped inside. Every word you just said has been documented. You're finished. Karen's composure shattered. She lunged forward, shrieking, "You can't do this to me. I built this community." But before she could get another word out, the board members stepped back, washing their hands of her. Rachel moved aside, and the AG calmly dialed his phone. "Sheriff? I need units at Clearwater Lake. We have a situation." The wail of sirens in the distance grew louder by the second. Karen clawed at her clipboard like it could shield her. "You're making a mistake. You'll regret this." But her voice cracked, the shrill authority gone. What was left was just fear. When the deputies stormed in minutes later, she didn't go quietly. She kicked, cursed, screamed about conspiracies and loyalty. But the cuffs clicked shut all the same. As they dragged her out onto the porch, the Attorney General looked at me. "This won't just bring her down. It'll expose the entire network. You did the right thing, Marcus." I stepped out into the cool night air, watching the red and blue lights flicker across the lake. The community's nightmare was finally ending. And for the first time in months, I could breathe. But what none of us realized that night was that Karen wasn't working alone. And taking her down was just the beginning. The sirens faded into the distance, leaving the cabin in an eerie silence. Rachel sat back at the table, rubbing her temples. The Attorney General closed his notebook with a sharp snap. And me? I just stood there, staring at the broken front door where Karen had made her last stand. It was over. Or at least, the first battle was. The arrest heard around the lake the very next morning, the news exploded. Local channels ran headlines like, "HOA President arrested on felony charges, state investigation underway." Clearwater Lake community rocked by embezzlement scandal. Neighbors whispered in grocery store aisles. Pickup trucks slowed down in front of my cabin. People who hadn't spoken to me in months were suddenly stopping by, baking casseroles, dropping off beer, shaking my hand. Not out of pity, out of relief. It was as if the community had been living under a storm cloud, and the moment Karen was cuffed and hauled away, the sky finally cracked open. But there was still a long road ahead. Karen clawed at her clipboard like it could shield her. "You're making a mistake. You'll regret this." But her voice cracked, the shrill authority gone. What was left was just fear. When the deputies stormed in minutes later, she didn't go quietly. She kicked, cursed, screamed about conspiracies and loyalty. But the cuffs clicked shut all the same. As they dragged her out onto the porch, the Attorney General looked at me. "This won't just bring her down. It'll expose the entire network. You did the right thing, Marcus." I stepped out into the cool night air, watching the red and blue lights flicker across the lake. The community's nightmare was finally ending. And for the first time in months, I could breathe. But what none of us realized that night was that Karen wasn't working alone. And taking her down was just the beginning. The sirens faded into the distance, leaving the cabin in an eerie silence. Rachel sat back at the table, rubbing her temples. The Attorney General closed his notebook with a sharp snap. And me? I just stood there, staring at the broken front door where Karen had made her last stand. It was over. Or at least, the first battle was. The arrest heard around the lake the very next morning, the news exploded. Local channels ran headlines like, "HOA President arrested on felony charges, state investigation underway." Clearwater Lake community rocked by embezzlement scandal. Neighbors whispered in grocery store aisles. Pickup trucks slowed down in front of my cabin. People who hadn't spoken to me in months were suddenly stopping by, baking casseroles, dropping off beer, shaking my hand. Not out of pity, out of relief. It was as if the community had been living under a storm cloud, and the moment Karen was cuffed and hauled away, the sky finally cracked open. But there was still a long road ahead. The Attorney General warned us, Karen wasn't working alone. This HOA racket? It runs deeper. She had enablers, paper pushers, and plenty of people happy to look the other way while the money flowed. We'll need testimony. Documents. People willing to stand up. Facing the fallout for every neighbor who cheered Karen's arrest, another stayed quiet. Fear lingered like a bad smell. Some people had benefited from her schemes, bought cheap houses after Karen forced out struggling families, accepted favors, turned a blind eye. And others? They were just scared of retaliation. Even with Karen behind bars, the thought of speaking up made them tremble. One night, an older couple stopped by my cabin. They'd lived at the lake for decades, but Karen had nearly bled them dry with violation fees over their faded siding. The husband's hands shook as he slid an envelope across my table. Inside were old letters, memos, even a few checks written directly to Karen's personal account. Proof she'd blurred every line between HOA business and her own pocketbook. He looked me in the eye and said, "We didn't know who else to trust. But we know you'll use this." It hit me then, this wasn't just my fight anymore. The whole community was counting on me, on Rachel, on the AG, to see it through. The rebuild begins. The weeks that followed felt like demolition before construction. Ugly truths surfaced: missing funds, rigged elections, even a secret slush fund Karen had been funneling into a lakeside property she planned to sell at triple the price. But for every dark secret uncovered, something brighter replaced it. Neighbors started showing up at community meetings again. Not the stiff, fearful gatherings Karen used to dominate, real discussions. People laughing, arguing, sharing ideas. Someone suggested we scrap the HOA entirely. Someone else proposed reforming it with a new board, bound by transparency rules. Rachel's role through it all: Rachel was unstoppable. She became the community's North Star, organizing files, pushing reluctant neighbors to testify, keeping the AG's office updated. She even drafted a proposal for a new HOA charter that banned excessive fines, capped board salaries, and required independent audits. At one meeting, someone asked, "Rachel, why are you doing all this? You don't even live here." She just smiled and said, "Because corruption doesn't stop at property lines. And because Marcus needed backup." That shut everyone up real quick. Karen's trial 6 months later, the courtroom was packed. Karen strutted in wearing a beige suit, still trying to look like the queen bee she once was. But the shine was gone. Her hair was thinner, her smile strained, her confidence cracked. One by one, witnesses took the stand. Families who'd been fined into foreclosure. Contractors stiffed on payments. Former board members who finally confessed. And when the AG played the cabin recording, Karen screaming about making it disappear and trying to bribe me in front of him, the jury's faces hardened like stone. It took less than 3 hours of deliberation. Guilty. On every count. As the gavel fell, Karen shrieked about conspiracies, about ungrateful neighbors, and betrayals. But her words bounced off the courtroom walls, meaningless now. She was sentenced to 15 years without parole. A new chapter that summer. Clearwater Lake looked different. Not physically, the cabin still leaned, the pines still swayed, the water still shimmered at dusk. But the energy had shifted. We planted flowers where weeds had overtaken walkways. Kids played outside without parents worrying about surprise fines. People waved again, genuinely, without the shadow of Karen's watchful eyes. And at the first official meeting of the reformed HOA, run by a volunteer board with strict limits, the community voted unanimously to elect Rachel as its first oversight officer. When someone nominated me for board president, I laughed. But when the votes came in, it wasn't even close. Me. The guy who just wanted to fix up his grandfather's cabin and fish in peace. Now I was leading the charge to rebuild trust, transparency, and unity at Clearwater Lake. Looking back sometimes, late at night, I sit on the porch with a cold beer, staring at the rippling water. I think about my grandfather, about the values he taught me: honesty, grit, standing up for what's right even when it's hard. I wonder what he'd say if he knew his little fishing cabin had become the battlefield where a corrupt empire fell. Probably something simple, like, "Good. About time." Because in the end, this wasn't just about one Karen. It wasn't even just about an HOA. It was about what happens when ordinary people stop letting themselves be bullied. When they push back, even against someone who seems untouchable. And as much as I never asked for it, I've learned something important. Sometimes, the quietest places hide the loudest battles. And sometimes, the people you least expect become the ones who change everything. Final cinematic shot: Marcus, Rachel, and a group of neighbors standing on the cabin porch, overlooking the glowing lake at dawn. A powerful sense of closure, unity, and a new beginning.